welcome aboard.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior climate reporter Andrew Friedman.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Andrew Friedman. I'm a senior climate reporter. It says it right back there. I don't need to repeat that. I am one half of the Generate newsletter at Axios. Please sign up. Welcome to our event, pushing forward on the path to clean energy. We'll be diving into conversations about innovation, using clean energy products, efficiency, all sorts of things that are top of mind right now in the energy transition. I'd like to say hi to my dad, who's newly retired, and said he'd be tuning into the live stream. So that's pretty cool. And if you're following along with today's conversation on X, formerly Twitter, please use the hashtag Axios events. We'll kick it off this morning with a senior member of a very crucial office that many of us may not have top of mind all the time, and that is the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And please join me in welcoming the Deputy Director for Industrial Innovation at OSTP, Justina Gallegos. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Andrew, and thank you for having me, Axios. It's an exciting event.
So I guess my first question is a little bit general, and that is, what are the three key priorities in your job when it comes to the energy transition that you're especially focused on, laser focused right now?
Sure. I'm going to give you four. So we are obviously steering one of the largest series and sets of climate action in American history. So it's a very exciting time. There are tons of things happening across the federal government. So it is the best time to be in climate and clean energy. And I just want to take a step back and think about some of the theory and principles that we are trying to drive that come through, particularly in the IRA. The big clean energy bill. We are first trying to incentivize increased supply of goods that have positive externalities. Obviously, that speaks to clean energy. So we're trying to build more and invest more with public dollars. We're trying to send really clear demand signals through things like consumer tax credits and leveraging the purchasing power of the federal government through procurement to pull forward all of these goods so that we can have more of them. And then third, we're really trying to solve these hard chicken and egg problems that often come through singular investments. And so we're trying to invest across the entire supply chain. So that means investing in both EV production, how to buy EVs, and then charging stations all together. So we're trying to have that full suite of complementary coordination problems. And then finally, we are trying to unlock private capital. So we know that the private sector alone has not addressed fully the climate crisis. And so we are trying to make strategic government investments that will trigger further follow-on private capital. And so you can see all of those targeted investments we're making across the IRA in nearly every clean energy sector. And you can see the indicia of that follow-on private capital really starting to move at scale, which is exciting.
Yeah, so we reported on that to some extent on Monday of this week. I wondered if you would give people a taste of that, because what you have been showing is this large jump in investments in clean energy development in the United States that, at least theoretically wouldn't have occurred without the IRA.
Yeah, so we are starting to see large booms in clean energy production and manufacturing here in the US, which is incredibly exciting. And so our team just released new analysis that was covered on Monday that shows that the private sector is doing that follow-on investment at scale in the US, which is very exciting. And so we already knew that since the start of the administration, there was about $70 billion in new clean energy manufacturing. So think of the inputs and production investment across the private sector. But on Monday, we found that there was an additional $133 billion in clean power generation, so actual power generation projects had been announced or come online. Think of wind and solar projects. That amounts to about 95 gigawatts. That's about enough power to generate clean power for 15 million homes, or about 12% of American households, which is incredible progress in such a short amount of time. And we've seen about a 36% jump in those clean power investment projects since the start of the administration, which is a huge trend. So you can clearly see that this strategy is starting to take off, and we are in many ways just getting started. And I could go into detail, but it's a really exciting signal of progress from that clear strategy to make clean, efficient, accessible power here in the US available to everyday Americans.
So as a climate reporter, I am perpetually cynical and somewhat shell-shocked, mostly covering extreme weather and climate events, of which one hit last night and this morning in Mexico. So one question that came to mind when looking at all that data is, what threats to such continued development are you and your colleagues possibly concerned about? We have, trade concerns with China's recent graphite announcement. We have, some labor issues with the strike in Detroit, which could potentially slow the roll on EVs and other things. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what could be potentially consequential that you have on your radar?
Yeah, so there are many challenges and opportunities, obviously, en route to building a robust and even more thriving clean energy sector here in the US. We could think of a lot of the principles that were core to the president's clean energy strategy from the outset. We often call that Bidenomics, but we think about building the economy from the bottom up and middle out. And so you have never seen a president be more pro-labor or pro-union in history. And so we support the enablement of good jobs. And when the president says clean energy or advancing environmental and climate action, he wants and means for that to be accessible to every American, particularly those who are building that clean energy future. So that's really important when we think about international concerns. We, of course, are excited about building and producing all of that clean energy at home, but are also excited about aligned partnerships and aligned pathways from other countries. We know that we are nowhere near the amount of clean energy generation that we need to solve the climate crisis. When you look at the 2030 commitments and the 2050 commitments that we know we collectively need to take as a group of nations, we are just getting started. And so those aligned pathways with partners are incredibly important. And I think thinking through all of those challenges and actively partnering with the private sector is a really key principle. So you'll see that come through in DOE's liftoff reports if you haven't had a chance to read those. I think it's energy.gov/liftoff. Those are, I think, a great example of the posture that our administration is taking with labor, with communities, but also with the private sector, because we believe that this transition is public sector enabled. That's those investments that the government is making, and private sector led, because we know that the government can't do this alone, of course. And so we need and want the private sector to step up and make those investments and make sure that jobs are accessible and have great wages as well for the folks who are actually going to be building those. So cognizant of all of those challenges, but we know we have a bigger challenge, which is the climate crisis, and thus we are leaning into addressing every single headwind that could pop up.
Yeah. How do you think the IRA is manifesting itself in people's everyday lives that they can see or drive or dial or press a button on? And is that process, do you think that that process will be tangible enough so people will understand that link to the IRA, or if you're, making it in more lay people's terms, Biden's climate bill by 2024, which is a key task for Democrats in hitting the campaign trail?
Yeah. So one of the key pillars of the president's clean energy strategy and climate strategy is to really give everyday families across America breathing room, particularly on their energy bills, and to make clean energy accessible such that you can see it. And I actually just purchased a home. I live in Boston on the weekends with my family, and so we'll be trying all of this out in the coming months. But there is a suite of credits that are already available to everyday consumers. If you go to the Department of Energy's Energy Savings Hub, energy.gov/save, visit it today if you haven't already. Tell your friends. You can get 30% off rooftop solar installation. You can get 30% off heat pumps. So think of heating and cooling systems. You can get up to $500 off new things like doors, and $600 off windows, 30% off insulation. I sound like a saleswoman, but there's so much good stuff on here. So you could think of $1,200 off other energy efficiency improvements. When you think of cars driving things, we know we'll have a $7,500 tax credit for qualifying EVs and a $4,000 tax credit for used cars, which is really important because we're trying to make this accessible to every family. And there's over $9 billion in rebates that are coming online for appliances and efficiency upgrades. So that's a lot of great things for both homeowners and renters that, if they are not already accessible, will start rolling out at the top of the year from state programs. And so in Massachusetts, I'll go to my state program very shortly and access those that are already available for things like insulation and heat pumps, but more to come. And I think that is already tangible, and we're seeing evidence of that across the country. But if you have not visited energy.gov/save, there is so much good stuff in there for everyday consumers.
Do you think, though, so like all that being the case, it is still a slog to get everyday people to know that that stuff exists and then to make that connection to the IRA? So when I talk to voters, they can usually name one thing that Biden has done on climate, like solar or EVs, but the whole picture and the things that are available to them, they don't seem to know. Does that frustrate you as somebody who is working so hard on that on a daily basis? It's not your particular job to go out and sell it, although I'm amazed that you had all of that on the cart. But like, is that a concern of yours and your colleagues that it may not be clear enough to voters to kind of move the needle if they're a climate voter, and climate voters do exist, thinking that they wanted Biden to do even more or aren't aware of what they've done, and you have been doing a ton of things.
Yeah, I actually see a little bit. It's a flavor of the challenge of so many things happening at once, and there is just an incredible amount of activity happening across the federal government that is focused on addressing the climate crisis, doing environmental remediation and protection, and then really building out robustly clean energy in nearly every sector. And so that amount of activity is often overwhelming, translating into everyday folks such that my neighbors in my community in Boston can actually see it. Is a challenge because we just got all this incredible activity underway, and it's really just getting started in that implementation phase. And so that is a challenge we're going to continue to address, particularly with partners and states. And you can see our lovely colleagues like Mitch Landry, who leads our infrastructure implementation, who is on the ground every day partnering hand in hand with mayors and governors to explain and make sure communities know, the risks that are posed to them from climate change, as you mentioned at the top, but also how to access all of this suite of consumer tools that will be available, if not already, very soon. So it is a challenge, but I think we continue to be excited about sharing that with groups. And so again, energy.gov/save. Go see it.
Where do you live in Boston?
Just outside of Boston.
Where?
Belmont.
Okay, I'm from Swampscott. So we can meet up on 128 somewhere.
Great. In our EVs.
Yes. What is the most surprising thing that people don't know about OSTP and what it's doing now, particularly this new division that you're heading up, which previously didn't exist?
Yeah. OSTP is one part of a really exciting, broader community of both clean energy and climate action that's happening across the administration. And so I would say one of probably the more surprising things is just the level of expertise and thoughtfulness that our government colleagues are putting into both crafting and around-the-clock implementation of this clean energy strategy. And so it has never been a more exciting time to be in government and be a small part of this incredible broader movement. But I would say the expertise and level of just thoughtfulness that folks are putting into implementing all of this as quickly as possible, such that our communities and colleagues around the country can really be able to access and use in our everyday lives all of these great tools that we've been a part of putting together is incredibly exciting.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. We are out of time, but going to have to leave it there, Justina. And thank you for being part of this Axios event. I'm going to go quiz you on which type of e-bike I should buy.
Thank you so much.
Please give a warm welcome to our View from the Top moderator and founder of Storyline, Chris Fritz.
Hey, good morning. Thank you all for joining us and for tuning in on the live stream. And a big thanks to our sponsor, UL Standards and Engagement, for making this conversation possible. Our next guest is going to talk a little bit about safety and sustainability. Please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of UL Standards and Engagement, Dr. David Steele. David. David, I'm excited to talk with you about this because I've done a lot of sustainability conversations and you don't always hear about the safety component. So I wonder a little bit about what does UL Standards and Engagement do when it comes to clean energy and sustainability?
Yeah, well, first of all, Chris, thanks for being here. Thanks to Axios for putting on this great event. Thanks to our crowd for getting up early to be here. UL Standards and Engagement, we're a 150-person nonprofit organization focused on making the world a safer place. And we do that through safety standards. For those who are wondering what's a safety standard, it's essentially a guidance document that helps manufacturers, others in industry, make products and services that comply with certain procedures and guidelines. It's not very glamorous sometimes. If I'm at a cocktail party and I say I work in safety standards, that's when the other person goes off to get another drink. So it's sometimes a harder sell, but standards are all around us in our everyday life. In fact, in the average American home, there's over 100 UL standards in different products, keeping your home safe. And now we're seeing this clean energy transition. From a few years ago, we set out to ensure that our standards would be relevant to that, because seeing all this innovation take place, Fundamentally, what standards do is provide a safe foundation, a safe baseline for innovation to take place. And that's what we're about. We've been at it now for 120 years of standards development, and we're very focused on clean energy.
So you've been doing it for 120 years, clean energy relatively newer to that space. So I wonder, when you look at that, what kinds of safety challenges do you see that could slow down the development and the advancement of clean energy?
So sort of backing up a bit, clean energy now is so much about electrification. And that's really in our past. Underwriters Laboratories, the sort of...
What UL stands for.
Exactly, thank you. Bit of an anachronistic term now, but started in 1894 coming out of the Chicago's World's Fair, because electricity was coming to buildings and they were catching fire. And so there was a need for standards, for testing, for safety science to develop to understand what were the risks there. So fast forward to today, and it's really the second wave of electrification. It's no longer about electricity to the home. It's now about electricity everywhere. It's about sources of clean energy. And so that's why we see for our standards development, clean energy is such a relevant, critical item, because just as we've been ensuring safety for 120 years of energy coming into the home, electrical wiring systems in your home and so on, fire safety, all of these different topics. Now we have a whole suite of safety standards, from wind turbines, photovoltaic installations, all the way through energy storage systems, which is so critical, through to different batteries, electric vehicles, e-bikes, and so on. So making sure we have standards at all points in that clean energy value chain. As a nonprofit, we take very seriously our social mission. So all our standards are freely available to view. And in fact, when we say we develop standards, the way we actually make standards, and again, this is where you drive the person off for their third drink of the evening, is the way we develop our standards is through our technical committees. And we have 4,000 volunteers on our technical committees coming from all parts of industry, government, consumers, think tanks, academia, all giving us the best input to achieve these consensus-based standards. So they're really, pardon the pun, the gold standard of safety standards. Once those standards are in place and once folks commit to them, then innovation can flourish safely on that safety platform.
So with those 4,000 experts, where are they worried? Where is safety being overlooked as we kind of bound forward on all of these new technologies? I mean, you hit them from e-bikes. We've seen, well, some of these are catching fire now, and we have EVs and all of these other pieces. What keeps your experts up at night?
So let's think about sort of two areas. One is this huge infrastructure build out, and Justina just talked about just this incredible build out of charging networks, of clean energy generation. People now talking about hydrogen and the role that's going to play. So this very large infrastructure build out, and making sure that that's done safely, and making sure that it's done in a way that doesn't impede the innovation, but does put safety at the core. There are standards for that. The second big area is related to consumers, and we recently did surveys. An alarming percentage of consumers don't even realize the safety dimensions of lithium-ion batteries. But those batteries are being used in all sorts of applications, right? You mentioned e-bikes, for example. So making sure in all those different devices that we have safety standards that are applicable in those areas, so that as we see this growth, and Justina also talked about incentives that are just propelling the growth here, making sure that those products are complying with standards where possible and safe. And to just pick on the e-bike example, so yes, New York City was having this huge challenge of e-bikes catching fire.
Right.
And turned to the UL standard, such that from last month, any e-bike sold, leased, or rented in New York City must be certified to our UL standards in that area. So it just provides that level of safety, of comfort for consumers, such that then when you buy a product or when there's a product in the value chain, you know that it's safe.
And how would a manufacturer work with UL if that becomes the standard? Kind of, what do they come to you and say what?
So typically they'll come to us, they'll look for the copy of the standard to understand what the details are. They can go out and get it tested and certified to that standard. And what we always hope is that folks will participate in our standards development process. So those various technical committees that we run, manufacturers are a big part of that, as are other stakeholders. And the beauty of this consensus-based standards process, this is the fourth drink now where they go off and like, gosh, I've heard enough of this. But the beauty of this process is how balanced the stakeholders are. So our standards are developed not by a particular manufacturer or by a particular industry. Industries are part, government entities are a part, consumers are a part, other industry groups, other think tanks and academia,
right.
So that the standard that emerges from this is something that can really ensure that kind of safety.
But I wonder, wouldn't the criticism be, well, you're going to slow down the progress because we have to meet all these standards and we're still trying to figure it out, and how do we meet a standard if we haven't even fully developed the technology yet?
Yeah, so sometimes there's that concern about do standards slow innovation. I think we actually flip that and say it's the absence of standards that can impede innovation, because what we've seen throughout our long history is if an innovation comes out and there's even a hint of a safety issue, then people can sort of recoil from adopting that. Right. When we saw these issues with e-bikes, the last like 12, 18, 24 months, a number of jurisdictions were seeking to ban them and say, you shouldn't be using this. But that's the wrong way to embrace an innovation like that, is let's see if we can come together, develop a standard that will ensure safety of that item, and then that way it can be used without concern. So oftentimes it's not that standards can impede innovation, it's the absence of standards with associated safety concerns that can actually lead to people questioning the adoption of new technologies.
So we have just about a minute left, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think?
How many drinks are we up to
now?
now?
We're five.
People are like, what more can I say about the standards development process?
Well, I am interested, kind of what you think as somebody who plays in this space is it's going to take to make energy, clean energy, a reality over these next couple of decades.
Probably the biggest thing, and it's why an event like this is so important, is just convening many different organizations together. I think what we've seen historically with new innovations coming out is it really is about having lots of people at the table. That's how we do our standards development process, so that government's involved, so that industry's involved, communities are involved, consumers are involved. Where we can, we're now running consumer education campaigns, but really bringing folks together, having a standard there to facilitate safety, and then let the innovation flourish.
Let the innovation flourish. I think that's a good place to leave it. Dr. David Steele is the Executive Director of UL Standards and Engagement. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right.
Introducing Axios national politics reporter, Sophia Kai.
Good morning, guys. You've had the White House perspective on an energy transition, and now we'll have someone from the halls of Congress. Please join me in welcoming New York Congressman Richie Torres. Thanks for joining us.
So you must have lots of free time while the House Republicans figure themselves out.
You know, the Republicans are going through the 5 stages of grief and have not yet reached the stage of acceptance, but we'll see. So.
Okay, we'll get into business. Yeah. We'll just let you leave it at that.
My prediction is Hakeem Jeffries will win in the first round when we win.
Noted, on the record,
So.
live and recorded. Congress has passed historic legislation when it comes to climate change.
Back when we were productive, yes.
This will be a running joke.
Kidding.
Now you've got a huge task, which is conveying what's in the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as letting your constituents know. How do you think that's going, both in your district as well as broader in the country?
I mean, I feel like it's been a success. I mean, the investments of the Inflation Reduction Act are going to unfold over time. But, you know, I come from the South Bronx, which is one of the poorest congressional districts in America. You know, and for us, combating climate change is as much about public health as it is about environmental protection. So I'll give you a concrete example. You know, we've been haunted by the legacy of Robert Moses, which includes the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is a structure of racism in the South Bronx. It's, you know, the South Bronx, it's left behind decades of displacement and environmental degradation. And every day to and from the Hunts Point Terminal Market, there are about 15,000 diesel trucks that create massive amounts of congestion on the Cross Bronx, that unleash massive amounts of air pollution. And so imagine if you're a poor kid in the Bronx, either living near the Cross Bronx or attending school nearby, you're breathing in pollutants through no fault of your own that cause you to have respiratory diseases like asthma. And so the IRA is going to build a world where we're radically reducing greenhouse gas emissions, radically reducing air pollution, and ensuring that people have a higher quality of life, lower rates of asthma. And that, in the Bronx, that's not an abstraction, right? That means a longer life expectancy and a higher quality of life.
I mean, it sounds like you know, this is deeply personal to you growing up, as well as for your constituents. And I wonder, you know, both in terms of the very real impacts of the pollution, but also in terms of making climate-friendly decisions like driving EVs, weatherizing homes, biking to work. How do you make that more accessible to folks in your district?
Well, you know, transportation is the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so electrifying transportation is the key, EVs. But we have to be careful to ensure that electric vehicles are not a privilege of the wealthy. You know, in order to have more electric vehicles, you need more EV charging stations. But in order to have more EV charging stations, you need more EVs. And people have to realize that.
So it's like the chicken and the egg.
Yes, it's a catch-22. And people have to realize that not every community has homes where you can have built-in EV chargers, right? We have to ensure that there are publicly available EV charging stations and that those EV charging stations are fast charging. So just like it only takes you a few minutes to fill your gas pump at the gas station, it should only take you a few minutes to charge your electric vehicle. You know, without publicly available fast charging infrastructure, communities like mine are going to be left behind.
So you've got IRA passed. You know, once the House does get back to work, what do you think is a realistic bipartisan opportunity in terms of what comes next? Could that be something like permitting reform?
I mean, in theory, there's a bipartisan consensus for permitting reform, but it never seems to materialize. But, you know, my understanding is that in order for us to decarbonize the American economy by 2050, we have to triple the amount of transmission infrastructure. And in the past decade, we've built no clean energy transmission infrastructure. Like, we're lagging far behind countries like China. And so permitting reform is an essential element of the clean energy transition. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll eventually get to a bipartisan compromise. but it has yet to materialize.
What sort of, shifts would need to happen? Because, I think one argument that proponents of permitting reform make is that it's kind of just this duality. You're allowing more, potentially more fossil fuel projects, but at the same time, you're also allowing for more clean energy projects. And the industry says that this is a must in terms of, moving forward through the energy transition, implementing, the legislation that has passed.
Look, I feel like the IRA is shifting the dynamics of the market in favor of clean energy. Like coal is increasingly a relic of the past, oil, fossil fuels are becoming a relic of the past. I think there's no stopping the momentum in favor of clean energy, but we cannot get to decarbonization without transmission infrastructure. Like in New York, most of the renewable energy production happens upstate. And so in order for New York City to become a clean energy economy, we need transmission infrastructure that's bringing clean energy from upstate New York to downstate New York. That's an essential element of the transition.
Are there other ways locally that your district has really seen like the impact of climate change? I'm thinking floods, the recent floods. I was born in Queens, right next to your district.
My second favorite borough.
I don't think we can get into this on stage.
You're cursed by the Mets, but don't worry about it.
We'll save it for the green room afterwards. Tell me a little bit more about what you're seeing on the ground and how that is being addressed or may be addressed by provisions in the IRA.
There's a sense in which America's largest city, New York, has become ground zero for catastrophic climate change. Like we know it's no longer an abstraction because of the extreme weather events that we've seen in the past few years. So 2 years ago in the summer of 2021, we had a rainfall that was so intense it was described as a once in a 500-year event. And there were residents who drowned in basement apartments. Our subway system was heavily flooded. There were strap hangers that had to be rescued from flooded stations. The Bronx River Parkway became the Bronx River. We saw a comparable flood, like almost apocalyptic levels of flooding a few weeks ago. I was here in DC because of the speaker drama, but New York was heavily flooded. Half of the subway system was brought to a grinding halt. And then a few months ago, wildfires in Canada led to levels of air pollution in New York City that were so hazardous that people were advised to stay home. So the world in which we live is so interconnected that there's no escaping catastrophic climate change. Like who would have thought, wildfires in Quebec would cause hazardous air pollution in the Bronx? But that's the world, that's the reality that we're confronting with climate change.
So it's no longer just felt by a few people.
I think it no longer feels abstract. 10 years ago, it might have sounded abstract. People are now seeing the reality of climate change in their own lives. It's not a distant threat in the future. It's a clear and present danger in the here and now.
I know you've been a proponent of addressing the effects of congestion pricing in New York. And in New York and other large cities, how do you make sure that as, for instance, you're moving traffic outside of Manhattan, that it's not having a disproportionate impact on the other poorer communities, outside of New York City, or in South Florida, for instance, if you're diverting traffic, or other sort of high population issues away from the city center, that it's not having this impact on poorer communities.
Well, I think when we're crafting plans for combating climate change like congestion pricing, we have to prioritize the principle of equity. So I'm a supporter of congestion pricing in theory, but the original environmental assessment, so New York is about to undertake the largest attempt at congestion pricing in the history of the United States. And I'm supportive of it in principle. The original environmental assessment indicated that there would be a diversion of diesel truck traffic from the central business district of Manhattan to the South Bronx, which is the most heavily polluted place in New York City. And I felt like that was fundamentally unfair. I was not going to allow the South Bronx to be a dumping ground for the diesel truck traffic of the Central Business District in Manhattan. And so I negotiated $155 million in investments from the governor's office, from the MTA, to mitigate the environmental impacts on the Bronx and to invest in EVs and EV charging infrastructure and asthma clinics to address these environmental consequences. But I think equity has to inform how we approach the fight against climate change.
I want us to grapple with the other side of this, and ask you if there is places where Democrats can work on when the party discusses an energy transition. Let me give you an example. There are entire communities where the local government is funded through fossil fuel taxes. So the energy departments, maybe schools, may be funded through fossil fuel taxes collected. And so, when you're talking about entire communities, moving that away from fossil fuels, it becomes a real problem. How do you think Democrats should be doing better?
It's the hardest, it's the hardest problem that we have to solve. I would say, well, first, I think whenever you have a disruption of the status quo, there's going to be some degree of dislocation. To claim otherwise would be intellectually dishonest. Like when there's a new technology, there are going to be people who face some degree of dislocation. But we have to craft policies that limit the collateral damage that's done to communities that historically have been dependent on fossil fuels. How can we prioritize those communities for the clean energy transition? How do we incentivize clean energy investment in those communities? And what excites me about clean energy is whereas fossil fuels tend to be concentrated in a few states, clean energy investment is going to be dispersed across the country. It's going to create broad-based prosperity across America.
I want to turn to Israel in the last couple of minutes we have. I know you've been vocal.
Are we moving away from the controversial topics? Or
Hey, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. Republicans, some Republicans have been taking one BLM chapter post that included a silhouette of a paraglider in reference to the Hamas attack with the words, "I support Palestine," to draw conclusions about the larger aims of BLMs and to say that the progressive left is pro-Palestinian and in some cases even pro-Hamas. What's your response to that?
It's fundamentally unfair because there are people like me who believe Black Lives Matter, but also support Israel and condemn the barbaric terrorism perpetrated by Hamas. So you cannot cherry pick one tweet and discredit a whole movement. So I reject that caricature of, and to be blunt, the greatest stumbling block to supporting Israel at the moment is not the Democratic Party, it's not the progressive movement, it's the dysfunction of House Republicans. If Hakeem Jeffries had the speakership and if House Democrats had the majority, we would have taken action to provide Israel with the funding it needs to replenish Iron Dome and to defend itself.
What do you say to progressive Jews who feel left behind by the left?
I think we have to be careful not to generalize, right? There were widely varied responses within the left, but for me, whatever your views on Israel, whatever your views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we should all have the decency to condemn terrorism, to condemn the cold-blooded murder of innocent children and civilians. Imagine a mother whose baby's been murdered in cold blood. I cannot imagine anything more cruel and callous than telling that mother, you had it coming. You and your people brought this terror upon yourselves. Like, that to me is not about politics, that's about human decency. It's indecent to blame the victims of terrorism rather than the terrorists themselves.
Right, it's more than politics.
I think it's about human decency. Like, you can, whether you're a supporter of Israel or a critic of Israel, we should all be united in condemning terrorism.
Richie Torres, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you.
Welcoming back to the stage, Andrew Friedman.
Once again, good morning, everyone. For our last segment, we're going to dive much deeper into the private sector world around climate action. Our next guest is the co-executive chair of Galvanize Climate Solutions, an organization that helps to synchronize funds with climate-friendly actions. Please give a warm welcome to Tom Steyer. Thank you for being with us this morning. I know it was an early morning for you. First, I just have to ask about your tie, because you're known for wearing plaid ties and occasionally plaid sport jackets. And I couldn't let the opportunity to do an interview with you go without asking about their meaning to you and possible meaning to the issues that you work on.
Well, it is a little embarrassing if the most interesting thing about you is your tie. But the reason that I've worn a red plaid tie when I wear a tie for the last 20 plus years is just to give myself a boost in the morning to get going, because as we're going to discuss, there is something going on in the world that requires a lot of energy if we're in fact going to succeed. And I like to get up in the morning and think, okay, here we go. Bring it on. Here's my tie.
I had toyed with trying to get a tie like that to match you.
I like your tie, Andrew.
Thank you. But I couldn't find any place that carried exactly that tie. So, getting to the topic at hand, in your conversations with venture capital funds and financiers, is the possibility of a successful Trump candidacy affecting investor sentiment in U.S. renewables, battery manufacturing, any part of the decarbonization business that we have before us today?
You know, that's an interesting question, and the answer is no. And let me just give you an example. I mean, you specifically brought up batteries. Our basic thesis is we have to win in the marketplace. This is about capitalism winning, bringing better, cheaper, faster, and cleaner products to consumers and customers, period. And so when we talk to somebody about developing, which I did, I think 2 weeks ago, a battery that will store energy for 72 hours, which would make it possible for the grid to be 80 to 90% renewables pretty straightforwardly. I think there are going to be a couple of battery revolutions in this decade. And so if we can do that, that just changes the math. You know, I think there is an assumption that somehow renewables need to be favored. Renewables did need to be favored. But if you look at the cost per kilowatt hour of coal, natural gas, wind and solar is killing them. Way, way, way cheaper. And the issue is, okay, but it's intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. We really can't afford to depend on this kind of unstable energy. And there are a lot of answers to that, but the simplest one is batteries, and batteries have gone down 90%, and we're looking at a couple more revolutions in terms of cost and in terms of duration. So this is about winning in the marketplace, pure and simple, people buying the best, cheapest, fastest product because they're going to do it for their own sake when they get, in the privacy of making an investment, purchasing decision.
Getting to purchasing decisions, because that's involved in the IRA, do you think voters out there understand what the IRA is, or at least something about what was in it, and connect it positively with the Biden administration, which would be potentially a key part of his ask in 2024?
Well, I think we all know the answer to that is no. They do not know what the IRA is, and they are not interested in what the IRA is. What they are interested in is their own lives, and whether, in fact, we are progressing to answer problems and for their lives to work out better. So when I look at the IRA, I look at the products that are coming out of it, the jobs that are coming out of it, the change in the world that is actually happening at a pace that people do not understand. And let me say this, Andrew, I don't mean to hijack your interview.
No, go ahead.
But I think most people do not know how bad the climate statistics are. And they're terrible. And if you look at the simplest measure, which is global air temperature, the whole point has been, which for Americans this is not meaningful, we can't go through 1.5 C. No one in America knows Celsius. No one has any clue what the hell that means, literally. But let's just assume that that is the boundary of safety, because the UN has now said that since 2015 in Paris. Last month we were at least 1.75 C over pre-industrial, at least. So when we talk about where we are, the statistics are terrible. But the other thing that's happening, this revolution is happening much, much, much faster than people understand, both in terms of the deployment of existing technologies like wind, solar, EVs, batteries, but also in the development of technologies to solve what are called these so-called hard-to-abate sectors. So I'll give you one other statistic just to keep in mind, which is we expect that in 2030, 7 years from now, 80% of the cars sold in the world will be EVs. So that means 8 out of 10 cars in every country in the world added together will be electric vehicles. That is a huge change. That is how economic revolutions happen. They basically go in a slow movement until they're better, cheaper, faster, and then they take over. And that's what we see happening.
I mean, a colleague of mine also is doing a story for today on how the uptake of EVs has been so much higher in democratic districts, democratic states, meaning big D democratic, than it has been in red states and in red counties. And there is some sort of partisan divide on EVs. We see that in presidential primary rhetoric, but it may be seeping into some of the actual data. I don't know whether it's like a delayed effect or whether it will really affect that particular curve. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, I think we're all aware, last I checked, we're sitting in Washington, D.C., that there is a huge partisan divide in this country that reaches to everything as far as I can tell. I mean, it reaches to the question of whether you're going to get vaccinated against a disease. That's now a political question. But I think we have to pull back for 1 second and remember, Washington, D.C. is still in the United States. This is not the world's largest car market. China is the world's largest car market by far. And China this year will be 40% in 2023 of China's car sales will be EVs. So when we're looking at a global market, when you're looking at other countries, if you're looking at the percentage of renewables in Vietnam, they had no renewables until I think 2018, and they have a higher percentage of renewable electricity now than we do. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about the world, yeah, we are still the largest economy. We're not the most populous place. We don't buy the most cars, and we're not going to end up with the majority either of the emissions or the electricity. So what we're seeing is a global revolution. If part of the United States decides that they don't want to get vaccinated and they don't want to buy the cheapest, best products for political reasons, that can happen because we can see it happen in vaccinations.
Yep. I want to get to some of the announcements over the past couple weeks over these mega oil mergers. What does it say about their thoughts, and maybe the thoughts broadly among the banking sector too, on decarbonization, that we've just seen Chevron and Exxon announcing these massive mergers that will add to their planned oil and gas production output through the 2030s?
So I would like to remind you the reason that I wear a red plaid tie to answer this question. I think it's instructive to step back from that specific question and just point out what oil and gas companies are saying about oil and gas usage through 2045 or 2050. And if you look at their public estimates of, right now the world uses about 102 million barrels of oil a day. And oil and gas companies are projecting 110 million barrels a day in 2045, Saudi Aramco publicly. Just so you know, the UN is projecting 20 million barrels a day, and that there will be 100% offset. So when we talk about the future, it's important to understand they are seeing a completely different future than certainly I am. They are seeing an energy transition to more oil and gas. And they just spent between them $112 billion betting that oil and gas would continue to be used at least as much, and that they are going to increase their position in that, and that they believe there will be political support for it. And I think we should step back one step further, which is this. There is this sense that somehow oil and gas takes place in a free market. You know, they're always talking about, goodness gracious, capitalism, free market. Okay, the estimate, I'm not saying this is right, but the estimate of how much oil and gas gets subsidized a year, $7 trillion. So let's say it's only $5 trillion. When we talk about a free market, every market has rules to it. Every decision about energy is a public-private decision, and they've been massively subsidized for as long as anybody can remember. What we're going to have to do is win in the marketplace by providing better things at a lower price. And that is what I believe will happen. But they have a distinctly different view, and all of their conversation and all of their palaver about we're going to be more efficient, we're going to do this in a better way, we are signing on to the Paris Accords. What they just said with 112 billion times is more oil and gas, more fossil fuels for the foreseeable future.
To climate voters, or voters who just have climate concerns among the portfolio of concerns that they have, how big are the stakes in 2024? Obviously, I can give my answer, but given the point that we're at when you look at the climate numbers and what's needed to happen over the rest of this decade, what is at stake, really?
Well, obviously, look, we're in a climate emergency. As I said, I think it's worse than people understand. I think our response is better than people understand. And the real question is, in America, we like to think we are the world, and that what the big impact of a different administration in Washington, D.C. will be impacts in the United States of America. You know, maybe a Trump administration wouldn't support the IRA, a Trump administration would try and move away from the tax credits, a Trump administration would approve a lot more oil drilling. Probably, conceivably true. That is not the big thing that's happening. This is global warming. We need, China is almost a third of emissions. When you look forward of where the emission growth is going to come from, it's not going to come from the United States. We'll stay on pretty much the same path. The question is the rest of the world, and in particular, the developing world. So when I think about a Trump administration, it's not that I worry that the United States is suddenly will change in many ways that I don't like, don't get me wrong. But the real impact in terms of the climate emergency is going to be, it's a direct attack on the idea of global cooperation. That in fact, what we need to do here is work together with other countries around the globe to make sure that we're doing our part, not just to reduce our own emissions, but also to help them. It's really important that the developing world has electricity that is clean. As an example, just one to put some numbers to it, the Democratic Republic of Congo has 100 million people. 10 million of them have electricity. They are going to have electricity, and where it comes from is going to matter to them and to us. India's going to have 5x the electricity generation in 2050 they have now. Where that comes from is going to be incredibly important to them, and it's going to be incredibly important to us. So international cooperation is something that very specifically a Trump administration would move away from, and that is something which we can't afford.
And quickly turning to international cooperation, we're coming up in around 40 days from now is COP28 in Dubai, headed by an oil and gas executive, heading up the climate talks, because that makes complete sense. So I'm curious what you think needs to happen there, and what some of your concerns might be, realizing that we're almost out of time.
Well, there are a lot of things that would be good if it happened at the COP. And let me say this. I think it's unfair to assume that someone who runs an oil company, the UAE oil company, who is also the head of the UN conference on climate, is somehow a bad person. But I would say that he is a person. And a person, including me, who has 1 trillion reasons to care about oil and gas, whether they want to or not, if you have 1 trillion reasons where every single person you're related to and love depends on oil and gas, to think that isn't in your thinking, whether you want it to be or not, is just silly. So when we think about, I was talking about, we're looking at 2 very different versions of the world going forward. Now, do I believe that the UAE is going to push for things that are going to be good at this COP? I do. Do I believe that there's any chance that they're going to push to end the use of fossil fuels? I don't. And I believe that, in fact, we're in a position where we're going to have to, as a globe, make different decisions, and that we're going to have to move to the cheapest, best products for all of us, and that we're going to have to support it publicly and privately. And I think we're going to. I absolutely think we're going to. But I think it's also very clear that the establishment around the world doesn't necessarily agree with that. The banking establishment doesn't agree with that. The oil and gas establishment doesn't agree with it. If there's $7 trillion worth of subsidies, those are coming from governments. So the governments of the world have not committed to this transition.
Well, Tom, we're out of time, but I greatly appreciate you joining us here this morning. Thank you to everyone here, to everyone on our live stream. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming. Thanks again to UL Standards and Engagements for making today possible. Please head to axios.com/events for more details on where you can find our events team next. We will be at COP28 if others are headed over there, including you. And please sign up, if you don't already, for the Generate newsletter on climate and energy. And thank you very much. Thank you.